is present here and now. And in the awareness of God's presence, let us pray. Father, Mother God, we give thanks for this opportunity to open to the awareness of your presence, to feel your energy move through us, arising through our hearts, moving to every corner of our consciousness and spilling out into this moment. As we feel this energy fulfilling us here, now, we bring to mind those in our experience that seem to have a need for the awareness of your love, of your guidance. We hold them in consciousness and we see them blessed and embraced by you here, now, in this moment, wherever they are. And in this awareness we give thanks. And so it is that together we say, Amen. Good grief. It's been a long time since it's actually been in production, but Peanuts? I ran across a Peanuts cartoon where Snoopy was doing his dance, right? The feet fluttering, the hands waving, dancing back and forth. And along came Lucy and said, if you knew what was going to happen, you wouldn't be so happy. And that immediately just, Snoopy moved into a different space. How many of you have had that experience where you've been absolutely joyous and someone comes along and pops your bubble? If you knew what was going to happen, you wouldn't be so happy. Well, I'm here to say you have a choice. This week has been, shall we say, an interesting week. It has had many tragedies that have occurred. Perhaps the one that is most in the news for a couple of days was the passing of Robin Williams. But, you know, he's one man. He's one person. There were more atrocities by the fighters of the Islamic State. There were more atrocities in Nigeria. Just this morning there was a news item that the clinic in Liberia that was treating the Ebola victims was broken into, and the patients or the prisoners were released. They were freed of their imprisonment because the people who conducted this raid on this hospital did not believe that Ebola existed. Well, they ransacked the place. They stole mattresses to, I don't know whether, I suppose they're going to sleep on them. Well, good luck with that. But there is a whole list of things for which we could be sad about, that we could grieve about. And, that can take us out of that space of happy into that space of glum. Oh my God, what's going to come up next? So, I'd like to talk to you this morning about how to deal with that. Not necessarily to give you a prescription, but to give you some ideas to consider. Because each person's processing of grief is going to be unique. It's going to be something that you will need to do. You'll need to find out what works for you. And perhaps one or two of these ideas will ring a resonant chord with you. Perhaps not. But let's talk about good grief. Good grief is that grief that allows you to process those losses in an effective, healthy way, so that those losses are acknowledged, so those losses are honored, so those losses are exercise for your strength, that you can move through your next moment with a rededication to that happy dance. Not that the happy dance is so deceitful, but rather there's all kinds of reasons for us to be happy. Take a breath. Wow. Think about all of the processes that go on just in that breathing. All of the things that happen within the body to allow your absorption of that fraction of the gas that was drawn into your lungs. And at the same time that those things that needed to get out of you, specifically the carbon dioxide, is offered back to this that we share. Not that any other particular individual would like to breathe in that carbon dioxide, but nonetheless, it can be processed by our plant friends and recycled. Wow! Think about that. Think about the miracle of this web of life that we are part of. Yes, there are people who are in our lives that are taken from us, either with foreknowledge or surprisingly, perhaps tragically. But think about the other things too. Don't let that loss limit you in your experience in this moment. How many of you saw the Peanuts cartoon that was brought up earlier? Okay. There is in our present moment, Lucy was talking about how she was able to experience the delight of this second. And, oh, here's another second that I can be happy about. And, of course, Charlie Brown said, I can't stand it, right? Well, we can come across to others in our second-to-second happiness, in the practice of the happy yoga. We can come across to others as being, well, downright, what's the word I'm looking for? Give me the word. Annoying, yes. Well, there are all kinds of reasons to be sad. Not just the loss of someone, but the change of relationship. How many of you have had a change of relationship recently, where you have acknowledged that, oh man, that is something that I really miss. I know I'm going to miss it. There are changes in circumstances. I was interacting with one person just last night, in fact, who was talking about his difficulty in finding a place to live. That for the last 2 weeks he's been living out of his car because he has not found a place where he could live at an affordable price. So we have opportunities to be sad, to grieve about many things. But we can actually encapsulate this concept of grief very easily by saying grief will arise when we have a seemingly irrevocable expectation that was not met. We can grieve whenever we have a seemingly irrevocable, unmet expectation. You know, I've talked about forgiveness in the past, about the expectation being the basis of any grievance that we might have. It's interesting that grievance and grief come from the same root word. They are essentially the same. A grievance that is on an irrevocable, unmet expectation, we call a grief. And the process of moving through and transforming that grief is about, first of all, acknowledging what it is that we are not expected to receive. When we have loss of a loved one, we're not expecting to receive that person's companionship, that person's humor, that person's wisdom, that person's day-to-day interaction with us. And indeed, there is great cause for sadness at that loss. When we have a change in relationship, or we have a change in career, or we have a change in living conditions that seem to be irrevocably unhealable, we will have opportunity for grief. But now on the flip side, acknowledging and honoring that condition, acknowledging and honoring that loss, does not mean that we need to be imprisoned by that loss, but rather that loss is just a step in our continuing evolution. Because as we learn how to process and to get on with life, we are strengthened by that experience. So how do we do this? How do we look at this? There's a processing that we'll talk about in a moment, but I'd like to set the stage with a passage from Matthew. Jesus and his disciples, it is said, left the crowd and went to a quiet place. And that quiet place the intention was to go there, apparently, and just to get away from the crowds. Well, the crowds this was supposedly early in Jesus' ministry, and the crowds had already heard that this was a great teacher, and that this man had information, that this man had wisdom, that this man was able to heal miraculously. What is this man about to teach? They followed him. And so it is written that the Sermon on the Mount was offered to this gathered crowd. Well, first of all, there were no public address systems. So if there was a large crowd that would assemble, there would be a process in conveying the message, and that message would be conveyed to the group that is within earshot, and then that group, the people at the back, would then turn around and say to the people behind them, this is what he said. And so it is that there is that wave of wisdom that would go through a large assembly, unless they were in an amphitheater, someplace that everyone could hear. Well, I look upon this Sermon on the Mount as an executive summary. You know, in today's business world, when we write a proposal, on the front end of the proposal, we'll put together an executive summary. That's so that the people who are time-pressed can scan the executive summary and see what the proposal includes. So I see the Sermon on the Mount as being an executive summary, because this was not written for at least 50 years after the ministry of Jesus. And it was likely written in Aramaic. There are some that say, well, there are some of the New Testament that was probably written in Greek. Well, maybe there was one or two, but the message that was written in Matthew was written for the Jews. And the Jews, while Greek was the lingua franca of that time, where Greek was the language of business, it was the language of the elite, of the educated, Aramaic was the language of the people. And Aramaic was likely the language in which Matthew was originally written. It was later translated to Greek. But George Lambza was a scholar. Turns out he was involved with Unity School of Religious Studies back in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. He lived in Syria. He grew up in Syria, in a village that spoke Aramaic. Virtually the same Aramaic that was spoken 2,000 years prior. So he had a very good grasp of the insinuations, of the figures of speech of Aramaic. And so he wrote extensively on the writings of the New Testament, putting it into the context of what it likely meant. Where's my clicker? Patrick, could you give me an advance? Thank you. So in the first four passages, first two passages of the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. And then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." George Lambza says, well, this passage, blessed are the poor in spirit, really is about the word roka, R-O-K-H-A. Roka is an Aramaic word that says pride. In this context, pride. Blessed are those who have small pride, because for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Pride. Pride is an interesting word. My daughter Shannon took Troy up to a photography workshop yesterday in Avon, hosted by John Fielder. John Fielder is a nature photographer here in Colorado, and he was offering this parent-child workshop, first one that he's ever done. And he offered it at a surprisingly inexpensive cost. It was $150 for both the parent and the child for a full-day workshop. And so Shannon and Troy trundled up to Avon yesterday morning for a 9 o'clock workshop. And Troy did very well. For a 5-year-old sitting in a lecture for 2.5 hours, he did very well. Now, he had to be bribed with the promise of a Lego stormtrooper character that Shannon would mail order for him. And he was able to sit through it. And then they went out into the field, and he had his own camera, and they took pictures. And frame by frame by frame, Shannon said you could see how he was improving in his photography. And he came through the day, and it was like she was so proud of him. And she came in this morning, or last night, she came in and she said, you know, I was really proud of him. And she said, can I say that? And she asked me that question because when she was growing up, I would not say to her, I'm proud of you. That word proud has a special level of baggage for me. And that level of baggage for me is that it does two things. Number one, it separates me, being proud, from God. Because back up please, with pride, there is separation from the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so that's a concept that I've been working with entirely through Shannon's 31 years on this planet. And the second thing is that when I am proud of her, I am unloading a similar baggage on her. Why is that? Because pride is a means of declaring that I am special. I am different. I am above, right? Do you see that? Do you get a sense of that? When you impose that baggage on someone else, what you are doing is you are giving them a ready excuse to separate themselves from others, to qualify themselves differently than others. And so, whether you agree with that concept or not, whether you agree with my parenting approach or not, nonetheless, pride has baggage carried with it. Now, I would tell her that I thought that she did an excellent job, that whatever characteristic came through her performance, I would acknowledge that. So, blessed are those who are poor in pride, for theirs shall be the kingdom of heaven. The next passage. Blessed are Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. As Jesus was speaking to this crowd, what he probably saw was a group of people that had a great deal of grief on their faces. Average lifetime in those times was about 35. There were the Roman occupiers that were very generous with their cruelty. There was disease that was rampant. There were opportunities for people to lose loved ones left, right, and center. And certainly the people as a people had been oppressed by the Roman armies. It had been 700 years since the throne of David had been occupied. And as a people, they were grieving for many things. So in this Sermon on the Mount, the writer offered that Jesus said that blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who acknowledge their own shortcomings. Blessed are those who acknowledge their own losses, because in that acknowledgement is the first step to being able to process the grief. So here we have then the grief. We acknowledge it, and then we're able to process it. There's since Robin Williams' passing, there have been any number of tributes that have been offered to Robin. I saw one last night where an individual's grandfather had murdered his grandmother and then taken his own life. And the family had gone through days and days of just utter despair. Could not understand how this could happen to the elders of their family. And so they had the funeral service, and they were all gathered in the church afterwards, and they in fact hung around to speak to everyone and to mourn together. It had been a very trying period, and they left the reception after the funeral and had gone by a donut shop, some Dunkin' Donuts or something in San Francisco, and happened into the donut shop, and Robin Williams was in the donut shop by himself having a donut and a cup of coffee. And he came over to them. This was 15, 20 years ago. He came over to the family who was gathered there, obviously, dressed in mourning clothes and not a smile on their face. And he introduced himself as Robin. This is through the mind's eye of this individual that was 7 or 8 at the time. He introduced himself as Robin, and he joined in a conversation with them, a pleasant but not jovial conversation. And step by step, he offered a little bit more joy to the group. And this writer said that he remembered that when they left, they were all laughing. It was the first time in days and days and days that any of those faces had been cracked by a smile. So here was a man who was willing to step into the maw of grief and help others be lifted. George Lambsa had this to say about this passage. Under the new order that Jesus was teaching, the people were to pray and work for their salvation. They must learn to love in order to be loved, to forgive in order to be forgiven, to be kind in order to receive kindness, to be merciful in order to receive mercy from their oppressors, to lend to others in order to be able to borrow, and to give in order to receive. All other teachings and attempts had failed to bring peace and comfort. That is, all of their Jewish teachings. And now the people had something practical and permanent to rejoice over and to make them forget their sorrows. The new teacher had given them hope and assurance for a brighter future. As we encounter our grief and acknowledge our grief and then step back and say, okay, I understand that, I acknowledge that, I honor that, what can I be happy about? And there are all kinds of things to be happy about. It's interesting that this week I happened upon an article in one of the news magazines that I subscribe to, online science magazines. And it was an article about the malleability of memory when it is recalled. That is, when we recall a memory, it is now in a state of flux. We can adjust that memory before we save it again. That was one of those forehead slappers. You know that I'm the kind of person that needs to understand the mechanics behind a particular process. And this was an explanation of why denials and affirmations work. Denials, affirmation, prayer, and meditation are the 4 tools that we talk about in unity. It's the 4th principle of unity. That this is the way that we transform our experience, through prayer, meditation, denials, and affirmation. Denials is a statement that takes away the power that has previously been invested in a particular idea. For instance, I am poor. Well, okay, how do I know I'm poor? Because there's nothing in my bank account. I don't have a place to live. It's been 2 weeks since I've had a roof over my head. The denial is to say that my last 2 weeks without a house, without an apartment, without a place to live, does not dictate what my next day will be. Okay? So it is kind of the reverse of Lucy coming along and saying, if you knew what was coming, you wouldn't be so happy. It's more like Lucy approaching a glum Snoopy and saying, there are so many possibilities that any one of them can bring you happiness. Think about that. And transforming Snoopy from a glum puppy into a dancing cherub. If we understand that when we recall a memory, that it is malleable, it's kind of like opening a Word document. How many of you have autosave on your Word, right? It's kind of like opening a Word document and saying, well, that memory is informative, but it's not very useful. I'm going to deny the power that that memory has. And then I'm going to add another paragraph to that document. And that other paragraph is going to be an affirmation. And that affirmation is going to be something to the effect of, I see that the right and perfect dwelling is going to manifest in my life now. Okay? You don't need to know how. You don't need to have a prescription. You don't need to set up a task list. What you need to do is you need to affirm that your condition is going to change according to your desires. Okay? So the denial takes away the power. The affirmation reaffirms a new truth for you. Well, this process of reaffirming a new truth is how we are able to address our grief. Acknowledge the grief. Identify what the unmet expectations are. Realize that those unmet expectations are not cast in stone. Yes, we may not, in fact, be able to have a conversation with Dad again. But what did Dad teach me? What is it in my heart that has arisen as a result of my relationship with him? And so it is that we can then affirm those gems in our memory. We can bring those forth. We can acknowledge and celebrate those. And in that process of celebrating those, what we are doing is we are transforming this next instant. As Lucy says, wow, that was a good one. Oh, here comes another one. You see, we have the choice of celebrating this next moment. That was a great deep breath. I feel so refreshed. Wow, look at the smile on that person's face. Ooh. Watch what happens when I smile. Bing. That smile is reflected. Now I can move through my moment and I can transform each moment and I can see how I am a party to the joy in that moment. Wow. That sends shivers up my back. My hairs on my arm are standing on it. Because we have the ability to do that. We have the ability to do that. We have the ability to do that. What do? It is our choice. So in this moment, we can make the choice that we are celebrating the breath of God now. We take a breath. We appreciate that breath. We take another breath. And we appreciate that breath. Moment by moment, breath by breath, we allow the present to be filled with our joy. Breath by breath, we acknowledge our place in this web of life. Breath by breath, we realize the miracle, the transformation that occurs in each breath. Wow. We can bring forth all practices, all kinds of practices, all variety of practices that will allow us to acknowledge and celebrate the miracle of this moment. But whatever practice we bring forth, it requires that we choose to do so. No one else can do it for us. And no one else can prevent us from doing it. It is completely ours. Breath by breath, miracle by miracle. The joy arises, exudes from us, and illuminates our moment. As we are empowered, knowing that we have this choice, we step forth. And choose rightly. In this awareness, let us come back to this time and space, sharing the words of the Lord's Prayer.